72 hours in a frozen hell. That's what the betting pool said would kill her. Sunrise on day 4, they figured, and they'd be shipping her home in a flag-draped box with a folded letter of condolence and the usual words about sacrifice and service that never quite captured the truth. But the 58-year-old colonel watching through binoculars from 3,000 miles away knew better. He'd seen that look before, burned into his memory like a brand that never faded. The eyes of a Viet Cong sniper who'd nearly killed him in the spring of 1972, back when he was just a kid with an M16 and more courage than sense. That phantom in the jungle had haunted his nightmares for 40 years. The difference this time? That killer was on our side. The summons came on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a staff sergeant who couldn't have been older than 25 and who addressed Colonel James Morrison with the kind of reverence usually reserved for museum pieces. The kid probably thought Morrison belonged in one. Silver hair cut high and tight in a style that went out of fashion sometime during the First Gulf War. Hands that still bore the scars from punji stakes and wait-a-minute vines. A chest full of ribbons that told a story spanning 4 decades, 3 wars, and more classified operations than he could remember, even if the government would let him talk about them. The Pentagon hadn't changed much since his last visit. Still the same endless hallways that smelled like floor wax and old coffee. Still the same photographs of stern-faced generals staring down from the walls, judging the living with the weight of the dead. Morrison walked those corridors with the careful gait of a man whose knees remembered rice paddies and whose back remembered sleeping on jungle floors. The general's office occupied a corner on the 3rd floor with a view that probably cost more than Morrison's annual salary. General Richard Hayes, 3 stars, a career built on logistics and political maneuvering rather than mud and blood, but a decent man nonetheless. He stood when Morrison entered, which said something about the nature of what was coming. "Jim, good to see you. Coffee?" "Black, thank you, sir." They observed the ritual. Small talk about Morrison's upcoming retirement, questions about his plans. Morrison gave the standard answers. Move back to North Carolina, maybe do some fishing, spend time with grandkids he barely knew because he'd spent their childhoods in places their parents couldn't pronounce. Then Hayes got to it. "Jim, I need you for one last job. Call it a favor to an old friend who's asking because nobody else has the credibility to do what needs doing." Morrison sipped his coffee, waited. 40 years had taught him that the worst assignments always came wrapped in flattery. "We've got a new program, CIA Ground Branch. They're recruiting women for direct action roles, field operators, combat positions." Hayes paused, measuring Morrison's reaction. "One of them is about to deploy to Afghanistan. Joint operation with a SEAL team. Reconnaissance mission in the Hindu Kush." Morrison set down his cup with care that barely concealed what he was thinking. "Sir, with all due respect, I know what you're going to say, Jim. I know your feelings on this subject. That's exactly why I'm sending you." "General, hear me out." Hayes pulled a folder from his desk. Thin, most of it redacted. "Her name is Sarah Mackenzie, 28 years old, Staff Sergeant, CIA Ground Branch, first female operator in the program. She's going into the mountains as an attached sniper with SEAL Team 7. Your job is simple. Observe, evaluate, give me an honest assessment." Morrison opened the folder. One photograph. Dark hair pulled back tight, gray-blue eyes that looked directly at the camera with an expression that gave away nothing. Pretty in a way that would disappear the moment she opened her mouth to give orders or pulled a trigger. "You want me to sign off on this program? I want you to tell me the truth. If she's the real deal, if women can genuinely perform in these roles, I need someone with your experience to validate it. If she's a political experiment that's going to get people killed, I need someone with the spine to say so before we expand the program." Morrison closed the folder. "And if I recommend shutting it down, then we shut it down. Your word carries weight, Jim. You've earned that. Nobody questions your judgment. Nobody questions your patriotism. You're 3 weeks from retirement with nothing to lose and no agenda except keeping soldiers alive. That's why it has to be you. The coffee had gone cold. Morrison stared at the folder, at the eyes looking out from that photograph with an intensity that reminded him of something he couldn't quite place. I've seen this before, sir. Good intentions, bad outcomes. Women are... He stopped, searching for words that wouldn't sound like what they were. Women are different, physically, emotionally. That's not prejudice, that's biology. Combat it's a special kind of hell. It does things to people, things that can't be undone. I know, Jim, that's the whole point. I need someone who believes that to watch her operate and tell me if he still believes it when he's done. Morrison thought about his wife, married 36 years this fall, thought about his daughter, school teacher in Raleigh with 2 kids and a husband who'd never heard a shot fired in anger. Thought about all the young men he'd commanded over the decades, sent into situations they didn't come back from. Letters he'd written to mothers who would never forgive him, even though they said they did. He thought about the idea of doing that with young women, daughters. Someone's little girl coming home in a box because old men decided she should carry a rifle. When do I leave? Thursday. You'll forward deploy to FOB Chapman, observation role only. You won't be in the field with them, but you'll have access to all intelligence feeds, drone footage, communications. You'll see everything, and then you'll tell me what you saw. Morrison stood, his knees cracked. 68 years old in 3 months, if he lived that long, and his body reminded him of that fact every morning. One last question, sir. Why her? Why this mission? Hayes smiled, but there was no humor in it. Because if she can't hack it in the Hindu Kush in winter against Taliban fighters who've been doing this since before she was born, then nobody can. If this program is going to work, it has to work under the worst possible conditions. We need to know now, Jim, before we commit, before we put more women in harm's way based on hope instead of evidence. And if she dies out there, then at least we'll know the truth. The helicopter that brought Sarah Mackenzie to Forward Operating Base Chapman touched down at 1600 hours on a Wednesday afternoon under a sky the color of old bruises. Morrison observed from the operations post, binoculars trained on the bird as it settled onto the landing pad in a storm of dust and rotor wash that turned the air brown. She was the last one off. Deliberate, Morrison noted. Not hanging back because she was scared, waiting because someone had to be last, and she'd chosen to own that position. Small, maybe 5'7" in boots, pack that had to weigh 70 pounds sitting on her shoulders like it was part of her skeleton. Rifle case held in both hands with a care that spoke to what was inside. Morrison lowered the binoculars. His gut tightened. She looked like somebody's kid sister, like someone who should be in college somewhere, studying something harmless, dating some boy who didn't deserve her, worrying about exams instead of bullets. But the way she moved, that was different. Economical, no wasted motion, no looking around like a tourist taking in the sights. She knew where she was going and she went there, and the dust and the noise and the whole machinery of war happening around her might as well have been wallpaper. Captain Mike Torres met her at the edge of the pad. Morrison couldn't hear the conversation from this distance, but he could read Torres's body language well enough. Arms crossed, weight on his back foot, the universal posture of a man who'd already decided this was bullshit and was just waiting for reality to confirm his opinion. SEAL Team 7. Morrison had read their files. Good men, solid operators. Torres had 3 deployments under his belt and a reputation for getting his people home alive. But he was also 36 years old and had come up in a culture that still treated women in combat roles like a social experiment that hadn't quite proven itself. Fair or not, Sarah Mackenzie was about to be judged by a standard that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with every woman who'd ever failed to meet it. Morrison had been on the receiving end of that judgment once. Vietnam, 1969. 18 years old, fresh out of basic, assigned to a unit that took one look at his baby face and decided he was dead weight. He'd spent 6 months proving them wrong, lost 3 friends doing it, learned that respect in the infantry wasn't given, it was taken, usually in blood. The question was whether Sarah Mackenzie understood that, and whether she had what it took to pay the price. The operations center smelled like sweat and coffee and the particular kind of tension that came from putting young men in a room and telling them to prepare for something that might kill them. Morrison took a seat in the back corner where he could see everything and be seen by no one. Observer status. He wore utilities without rank insignia, though everyone in the room knew who he was. Word traveled fast on a base this size, and the arrival of a decorated Vietnam veteran in the twilight of his career tended to generate conversation. Lieutenant Commander Jack Rhodes ran the briefing, 42 years old, good officer, the kind who'd made rank through competence rather than politics. He stood at the front of the room beside a map of the Hindu Kush that looked like someone had crumpled up a piece of paper and tried to smooth it back out. All ridges and valleys and terrain that wanted to kill you. Gentlemen, Rhodes nodded once to Sarah, who sat in the second row, separated from the SEAL team by an empty chair on either side. And Staff Sergeant Mackenzie, thank you for coming. Let's get started. The mission briefing was standard, reconnaissance operation. Suspected Taliban weapons cache in a valley 12 kilometers north of their current position. Intelligence assessment put the enemy force at 15 to 20 fighters. Lightly armed, minimal coordination. Time frame was 36 hours, start to finish. In at dusk, observe and document, mark the target for a follow-up strike team, extract at first light the day after. Morrison listened with half his attention while the other half studied Sarah Mackenzie. She sat perfectly still, no fidgeting, no nervous energy, just absolute presence. Her eyes tracked the map as Rhodes outlined the route. Morrison saw her lips move slightly, counting distances, calculating time. When Rhodes got to the medical brief, Morrison saw Sarah's expression change for the first time. Hospital corpsman David Park ran through the casualty evacuation plan. 27 years old, wedding ring on his left hand, that careful optimism of a man who had something waiting for him that was worth staying alive for. Rhodes moved to extraction procedures, primary landing zone at the northern ridge, secondary position on the eastern slope. If both were compromised, the team would execute escape and evasion protocol. 20 kilometers back to base through hostile territory. Not ideal, but doable if things went completely sideways. That's when Sarah spoke for the first time. Sir, rules of engagement if we're separated. The room went quiet. Nobody planned for separation on a routine reconnaissance mission. Nobody asked about it unless they'd been separated before and knew what it meant. Recognition struck Morrison. He'd asked that same question in 1971 before an operation in the A Shaw Valley that went bad in ways the after-action reports never quite captured. Rhodes looked at Sarah for a long moment. We're not planning on getting separated, Staff Sergeant. Respectfully, sir, plans change. They do. If separated, break east. 20 kilometers to FOB Solo. E&E protocol. Avoid contact. Link up with friendly forces. Any other questions? Sarah studied the map for 3 seconds. Morrison counted them. No, sir. Understood. She sat back and Morrison saw something in her posture that made him lean forward. This woman had already played the whole mission through in her head. She'd found the failure points. She'd calculated the contingencies. She was asking about separation because she'd already seen the scenario where it happened and wanted to know the rules before she broke them. That's when Morrison made a decision he would later question. He stood up. The room turned. Rhodes looked surprised. Morrison had been silent for the past 30 minutes. Colonel Morrison, Rhodes straightened. Did you have something to add? Morrison looked at Sarah Mackenzie. She met his eyes without flinching. 40 years separated them. He'd been fighting wars before she was born. He'd seen things she couldn't imagine. But in that moment, Looking at her across a room full of young men preparing for violence, he saw something that made his certainty waver. "Nobody gets separated on my watch, Staff Sergeant." The words came out harder than he intended. 4 decades of command voice. The tone that expected obedience because it had always received obedience. Sarah didn't blink. "With respect, Colonel, you're not on this operation. I am." Silence pressed down on the room like a physical weight. Morrison felt every eye on him, felt the expectation. This young woman, barely older than his granddaughter, had just talked back to a legend. The room waited to see what legends did when challenged. Morrison held her gaze, saw no disrespect there, no defiance for its own sake, just a simple statement of fact delivered without apology. She was right. He wasn't going on this mission. She was. And she deserved an answer to her question that acknowledged that reality. "We'll see, Staff Sergeant." He sat back down. The briefing continued, but Morrison's attention had narrowed to a single point. Sarah Mackenzie sat in that chair with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the map, and Morrison realized with uncomfortable clarity that she reminded him of someone. Himself, 40 years ago, before the jungle, before the letters to families, before he learned that courage and skill and determination could still get you killed if luck decided to look the other way. The briefing ended. The team filed out. Sarah was the last to leave, the same way she'd been the last off the helicopter. Morrison sat alone in that empty briefing room and felt a weight settle over him that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with responsibility. General Hayes wanted an evaluation, wanted Morrison to observe and report and tell him whether women belonged in combat. But Morrison realized as he sat there that the question wasn't whether Sarah Mackenzie could do this job. The question was whether Morrison could live with himself if he recommended shutting down the program and she proved him wrong after it was too late. Morrison hadn't slept. 72 hours from now, Sarah Mackenzie and SEAL Team 7 would be on the ground in the Hindu Kush. 48 hours after that, they'd be extracted, assuming everything went according to plan. Morrison had stopped believing in plans somewhere around his third deployment. He stood in the Tactical Operations Center, a climate-controlled bunker filled with screens and communications equipment, and the quiet hum of electronics that cost more than most people made in a lifetime. The TOC was where officers went to watch young men die in real time and tell themselves they'd done everything they could. Morrison had spent too many hours in rooms like this. The drone feed showed the target valley. Thermal imaging painted the landscape in shades of gray and white. No movement, no heat signatures, just mountains and snow and the kind of cold that killed you as surely as bullets if you let it. "Colonel," the voice came from behind him. Morrison turned. Young intelligence officer, maybe 30. Computer science degree from somewhere expensive. Probably never fired a weapon outside a range. "What do you have, Lieutenant?" "Latest intel on the target area. Taliban activity has increased in the past 72 hours. We're now estimating 35 to 40 fighters. Possibly more. They've moved in heavy weapons, PKM machine guns, RPGs. This isn't the light resistance we briefed." Morrison's jaw tightened. "Does Rhodes know?" "Yes, sir. He's evaluating whether to scrub the mission." "And?" "He's leaning toward going anyway. Says his team can handle it. Reconnaissance only. Observe and avoid contact." Morrison stared at the screen, at the valley that had just become exponentially more dangerous than anyone had planned for. "What about Mackenzie? Does she know?" The lieutenant hesitated. "The briefing goes out to the whole team in 30 minutes. Morrison nodded slowly. 30 minutes. 30 minutes for Sarah Mackenzie to look at updated intelligence and decide whether she still wanted to do this. Whether proving something to men who doubted her was worth walking into a valley with 40 hostiles who would show her no more mercy than they'd show any other American. "Colonel, can I ask you something?" Morrison didn't take his eyes off the screen. "Go ahead, Lieutenant." "Why are you here? I mean, respectfully, sir, you're 3 weeks from retirement. You could be anywhere. Why this mission? Morrison thought about the answer, about General Hayes and his request, about the folder with the photograph of a young woman who looked like she should be anywhere except preparing to walk into hell, about the question that had defined Morrison's career and that he'd thought he'd answered decades ago, but apparently hadn't. Because someone needs to watch. Watch what, sir? What happens when we send our best into the worst, and whether they come back? The lieutenant didn't have a response to that. Morrison didn't expect one. He'd learned a long time ago that some truths couldn't be explained. They could only be witnessed. Morrison found her on the range. The base had a long-distance shooting facility, 500 meters. Not much by sniper standards, but enough for final weapons checks and zeroing optics before an operation. Sarah Mackenzie was alone, which told Morrison she'd either requested privacy or everyone else had decided to give her space. Probably both. She was prone behind her rifle. M110 SASS, semi-automatic sniper system, 7.62 NATO, effective range 800 meters, good weapon, reliable. Morrison had seen enough operators work with it to know what competent looked like. Sarah Mackenzie wasn't competent. She was something else. Morrison stood 50 meters back, observing through binoculars. She fired, paused, adjusted the scope, fired again. The sequence repeated with mechanical precision. No wasted movement, no frustration when shots didn't group the way she wanted. Just calm adjustment and immediate application. Morrison walked closer. She heard him coming, had to. But she didn't turn, didn't acknowledge, just kept working. Staff Sergeant, Sarah squeezed the trigger, waited for the round to impact, then she looked up. Colonel, Morrison knelt beside her position. His knees protested. He ignored them. Mind if I watch? It's a free country, sir. She turned back to her rifle, settled into position. Morrison noticed her breathing. 4 count in, 4 count out, firing on the natural pause between breaths when the body was most still. Textbook technique, the kind you couldn't fake. How many rounds have you put through that weapon? 63,000, sir, give or take. Morrison raised his eyebrows. You keep count? I keep track of everything, Colonel. Comes with the job. She fired. Morrison studied the target through his binoculars. Center mass, 3 shots grouped so tight you could cover them with a quarter at 500 meters. You're good. Sarah didn't respond. Didn't need validation from him or anyone else. Morrison respected that even as it frustrated him. Can I ask you something, Staff Sergeant? Yes, sir. Why are you doing this? Sarah lowered her rifle, turned to look at him fully for the first time. Up close, Morrison could see that she was younger than her file suggested. Or maybe older, hard to tell. Combat had a way of aging people in ways that didn't show in calendars. Doing what, sir? This, the military, ground branch, walking into a valley with 40 hostiles and a team that doesn't trust you. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was steady. I'm doing it because someone has to. Because the mission requires a sniper, and I'm a sniper. Because 7 men are going into a dangerous place, and they need someone watching their backs. That's the job, Colonel. The rest is just noise. The rest is your life, Staff Sergeant. Whether you come home, whether your family sees you again, that's not noise. No, sir, it's not. But it's also not unique to me. Every man on that team is making the same calculation. The only difference is nobody questions whether they belong there. Morrison felt the weight of that statement. She wasn't wrong. Nobody had sent him here to evaluate whether Captain Torres should be allowed to operate. Nobody questioned whether Hospital Corman Park was physically capable of doing his job. Sarah Mackenzie was being held to a different standard for no reason except biology and tradition. You're right, Morrison said quietly. For what it's worth, you're right. It's not fair. I'm not looking for fair, Colonel. I'm looking to do my job and bring my team home alive. Fair is something people worry about when they're not fighting for their lives. She turned back to her rifle. Conversation over. Morrison stood, knees cracking again, and walked away feeling like he'd just been schooled by someone half his age who understood war better than he wanted to admit. The helicopter sat on the pad like a metal insect, rotors tied down, crew chief running final checks. Morrison observed from the operations center as SEAL Team 7 loaded equipment. Rhodes, Torres, Park, Sullivan, Brooks, Rivera, Santiago. 7 men whose names Morrison had memorized because in 4 hours they would become his responsibility in a way that had nothing to do with rank or orders. And Sarah Mackenzie, the 8th, walking toward the bird with that same economical grace he'd noticed when she arrived. No hesitation, no looking back. Colonel, the intelligence officer again. Morrison was starting to learn his name. Lieutenant Matthews. Latest thermal sweep of the valley. Morrison examined the screen. More heat signatures than the previous scan. Concentrated in 3 positions. North, west, south. That's an L-shaped ambush setup. Yes, sir, we think so. You think so or you know so? Matthews swallowed. We assess with moderate confidence that the Taliban forces have established ambush positions covering the primary approach route. Have you told Rhodes? Yes, sir. He says they'll adjust their route. Come in from the east, bypass the prepared positions. Morrison studied the map, studied the terrain, studied the 100 ways this could go wrong, and the maybe 3 ways it could go right. Get me a comm line to the team. Sir, I want to talk to Rhodes, now. Matthews moved fast. 30 seconds later, Morrison had a headset. Rhodes' voice came through clear despite the distance. Colonel Morrison, what can I do for you? Rhodes, I'm looking at this intelligence. I don't like it. Neither do I, sir, but the mission stands. We'll adapt. You're taking a female operator into what looks like a prepared ambush. If this goes wrong, it won't matter what gender anyone is, Colonel. We're all equally dead, but I have faith in my team, and I have faith in Staff Sergeant Mackenzie. Morrison heard the edge in Rhodes' voice, the barely concealed frustration. This wasn't Rhodes' first deployment, and it wasn't Morrison's first time being the old man questioning decisions made by people in the field. I'm not questioning your judgment. I'm asking you to question mine. I came here with certain beliefs about women in combat, about capabilities and limitations. I'm asking you to help me figure out if those beliefs are still valid, or if I'm just an old man stuck in the past. Rhodes was quiet for a moment. Sir, I don't know if Sarah Mackenzie can do what we're asking her to do. I know her file. I know her qualifications. But files and reality are different things. The only way we find out is to trust her until she gives us a reason not to. And so far, she hasn't given me that reason. The helicopter on Morrison's screen showed Sarah climbing aboard. Last one in. Fair enough, bring them home. That's always the plan, sir. The line went dead. Morrison set down the headset as the helicopter's rotors began to turn. The bird lifted off in a storm of dust and noise, then disappeared toward the mountains that held the valley where everything was about to change. He thought about Sarah Mackenzie, thought about the way she'd looked at him on the range when she said the only difference was that nobody questioned whether the men belonged there. Thought about the casual dismissal in Torres's body language. Thought about the weight of assumptions he'd carried for 4 decades. The helicopter was gone now, just a speck against the mountains. Morrison stood alone in the operations center, surrounded by screens and satellites, and all the technology that was supposed to keep people safe, but never quite managed to. He thought about 1972, about the Viet Cong sniper who'd killed 3 of his friends before they'd finally driven her off with artillery, about the rage he'd felt, about the hatred that had sustained him through the rest of his tour, about the moment years later when he'd realized that the woman who'd nearly killed him was just doing her job, the same way he'd been doing his. Warriors recognized warriors. Gender didn't change that, neither did nationality. The rifle didn't care who pulled the trigger. The bullet didn't care who it killed. War was the great equalizer, and Morrison had spent 40 years pretending it wasn't. The screens showed empty sky. The drone feed showed empty mountains. Morrison settled into a chair that would become his home for the next 3 days and prepared to watch. Because someone had to. Because that's what old soldiers did when they couldn't fight anymore. They watched the young ones fight, and they hoped, and they prayed, and they waited to see who came home and who didn't. And they lived with the answer either way. The ambush came at 03:47 hours on the second day, exactly when Morrison's instincts said it would. He'd been monitoring the drone feed for 16 hours straight, eyes burning, coffee going cold in a cup he kept forgetting to drink from. The thermal imaging showed SEAL Team 7 moving through a narrow valley, textbook formation, Torres on point, Sarah Mackenzie at the rear in the tail-end Charlie position where ambushes hit hardest. The heat signatures bloomed on 3 sides before anyone on the ground saw them. North, west, south. Exactly where the intelligence had predicted. Exactly what Morrison had feared. The first RPG lit up the screen like a falling star. Morrison was on his feet before the explosion sound reached the microphones. His hand found the communications console, fingers moving with muscle memory, 40 years old. Contact! Contact! Team 7 has contact, 3 sides, heavy weapons. The TOC erupted around him. Officers running to stations, radio chatter flooding the speakers. But Morrison's eyes stayed locked on that screen. Thermal signatures scattered and regrouped. Muzzle flashes strobed in the darkness. What had been an orderly patrol turned into chaos in the space between heartbeats. Lieutenant Matthews appeared at his shoulder. "Sir, we're getting reports of 35+ hostiles. PKM fire from the north, RPGs from west and south. Team 7 is breaking east, moving to cover." The thermal signatures converged on a narrow ravine. Morrison counted them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. His chest went cold. "Where's Mackenzie?" Matthews leaned closer to the screen, fingers working the controls to zoom and enhance. I had her thermal signature 30 seconds ago. She was at the rear, right behind Sullivan." "Where is she now?" Matthews worked the controls. The thermal overlay shifted through different spectrums. Infrared, night vision, standard optical. Nothing. "Sir, I've lost her signature. She's not showing on any feed." Morrison's hands gripped the edge of the console hard enough to hurt. "Replay the last 60 seconds. Show me where she was when contact initiated." The screen flickered, rewound. Morrison studied the patrol moving forward in reverse. The RPG explosion unhappening, time flowing backward until he could see all 8 thermal signatures intact. "There, freeze it." Matthews froze the image. 8 figures in formation. Sarah Mackenzie clearly visible at the rear, rifle up, scanning her sector. "Now play it forward, slow." The explosion happened again in slow motion. Morrison tracked the team scatter. Roads led them east into the ravine. 6 men followed, and Sarah Mackenzie's thermal signature flickered once, twice, then vanished completely. "She went dark before the second RPG hit," Morrison said quietly. "Look, right there. She drops into a depression and her heat signature disappears. Could be KIA, sir. Could have taken shrapnel. Or she went to ground deliberately. Thermal blanket. Snow cover. She'd know how to mask her signature if she needed to." Matthews looked at him with the expression of a man who wanted to believe, but couldn't quite get there. "Sir, why would she do that? Her team is moving east. Her survival depends on staying with them." Morrison didn't answer immediately. He replayed that moment where Sarah Mackenzie disappeared, remembering something from a long time ago. A Viet Cong sniper who'd killed Morrison's point man and then vanished. The entire platoon had searched for 3 hours. found nothing. Later they'd learned she'd been less than 20 meters away the whole time, buried in a spider hole, waiting for them to give up and move on. Show me the enemy positions, the ones we couldn't see from the team's perspective. Matthews brought up a wider tactical view, and there it was. A third element, 8 fighters with a PKM machine gun, moving fast from the northeast, positioning to cut off the team's retreat route. Understanding crystallized. She saw them. She saw the flanking element and knew if Rhodes kept pulling back, they'd walk straight into it. Everyone would die. Sir, I don't... She separated deliberately, drew the pursuit away from the team. Or she's doing something else, something we can't see from up here. Morrison grabbed the radio handset, switched to Rhodes' frequency. Team 7, this is Overwatch. Do you have visual on Mackenzie? Static. Then Rhodes' voice, tight with stress and fear. Negative, Overwatch. Last visual was during initial contact. She was at rear position. Then, nothing. We think she might have been hit. I have her last position. She went dark deliberately. Not KIA. I repeat, not KIA. She saw something you didn't and made a decision. Overwatch, we can't go back for her. We've got wounded. Park took shrapnel. We need to move, now. Morrison closed his eyes, opened them, made the hardest call of his career. Understood, Team 7. Continue to rally Point Bravo. I'll keep eyes on Mackenzie's last position. If she's alive, I'll find her. Copy, Overwatch. The line went quiet except for the sound of men breathing hard and the distant pop of gunfire that the microphones barely picked up. Morrison set down the handset and stared at the screen showing the empty space where Sarah Mackenzie had been. Sir, Matthew's voice was careful. If she's out there alone with 35 hostiles, the math isn't good. The math is never good, Lieutenant. That's why we don't trust it. Morrison settled back into his chair. He'd been awake for 18 hours. He'd be awake for 54 more before this was over. Sleep was something other people did. He had a soldier missing in hostile territory, and that soldier happened to be the one person whose survival or death would define whether his 40-year career had been based on truth or prejudice. He was going to watch. He was going to find her. And then he was going to pray that she was as good as everyone said she was. Because if she wasn't, they'd be shipping her home in pieces. The first shot came 48 minutes later. Morrison had been scanning the thermal feed in a grid pattern, working outward from Sarah's last known position. He'd found nothing. The area was cold, empty. The Taliban fighters had pulled back to regroup after the initial ambush. SEAL Team 7 was holed up in the ravine 3 kilometers east, treating Park's wounds and trying to figure out their next move. Then a single heat signature bloomed on the northern ridge. Muzzle flash, suppressed, the distinctive thermal pattern of a precision rifle being fired with a sound suppressor that dropped the acoustic signature to almost nothing. The weapon's thermal signature told Morrison everything. Suppressed 7.62 millimeters, Sarah's M110. She was alive. Morrison was on the comms before the signature faded. All stations, I have weapons fire, Northern Ridge, grid 4277, single shot, suppressed, confirm. The radio crackled. Taliban intercepts. Their fighters were shouting to each other in Pashto. Morrison didn't speak the language, but he'd heard enough combat radio chatter to recognize panic when he heard it. Lieutenant, get me a translator. I want to know what they're saying. Matthews ran. Came back 90 seconds later with a young specialist whose name Morrison didn't catch and didn't care about. What are they saying? The specialist listened to the intercepted transmission, headphones pressed tight. Sir, they're reporting a casualty. One of their radio operators. Shot through the upper chest. They can't locate the shooter. They're scared. One of them just said the word for jinn, spirit, demon. Something fierce and proud moved through Morrison's chest. She's alive, and she's hunting them. He switched back to Rhodes's frequency. Team 7, Overwatch. Your sniper is active. Confirm one enemy KIA, Northern Ridge, approximately 400 meters from her last position. She's moved and she's engaging. Rhodes' voice came back stunned. Overwatch, confirm. Mackenzie is engaging enemy forces? Alone? Affirmative, Team 7. Single shot. Target down. She's doing what snipers do. Morrison could hear the disbelief in the silence that followed, could imagine what Rhodes was thinking, what all of them were thinking. One woman, alone, in sub-zero temperatures, against 35 hostiles, and she wasn't running, she was fighting. Sir, Matthews was pointing at the screen, I've got Taliban elements moving toward her last firing position. 12 fighters. They're searching for her. The thermal signatures spread out in a search pattern across Morrison's display. They moved through the area where that muzzle flash had appeared. Found nothing. She's already gone. She fired and moved. Textbook sniper doctrine. 43 minutes later, the second shot. Different position. 300 meters east of the first. Another muzzle flash. Another thermal signature dropping. Another burst of panicked radio chatter that the translator struggled to keep up with. They're saying they found another body, one of their team leaders. Single shot, base of the skull. Sir, they're saying the tracks just disappear. Like whoever did this just vanished into the air. Morrison leaned back in his chair. A smile touched his lips for the first time in hours. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of a man recognizing something he'd seen before. Vietnam, 1972. We called her the White Ghost. Viet Cong sniper. She killed 7 of my platoon over 3 days. We never saw her. Never heard her. Found her firing positions after she'd moved on. Tracks would just stop, like she could fly. Matthews looked at him. Did you ever find her? No. She killed 2 more Americans the next week. Then she disappeared. Intelligence said she was a girl, maybe 18 years old. Farm girl from some village we couldn't pronounce. But she could move through jungle like smoke and kill at ranges we didn't think possible with the equipment she had. Morrison turned back to the screen. Sarah Mackenzie just showed me something. The warrior spirit isn't bound to any flag or any war. It's a skill set, a mindset, and apparently it doesn't give a damn what gender you are. The hours blurred together. Morrison stopped sleeping, stopped eating except when Matthews forced food into his hands. His world contracted to the drone feed and the radio intercepts and the slowly mounting evidence that Sarah Mackenzie wasn't just surviving. She was winning. Third shot at 0623 hours. Observation post on the Western Ridge. The Taliban had set up 4 positions to watch the valley. Sarah took out the westernmost one. Single shot, no follow-up. The fighter's partner ran, just stood up and sprinted south, abandoning his post and his weapon in any pretense of discipline. Fourth shot at 0847. A patrol moving through the trees. The lead scout dropped. The others scattered, fired blindly into the mountains. Wasted ammunition on shadows and fear. Fifth shot at 1034. A machine gun position. Not the gunner, the assistant gunner, the man feeding the belt. Sarah had chosen a target that would disable the weapon without the obvious kill. More psychological warfare. The gunner abandoned his position, refused to man the PKM without support. Morrison tracked it all unfold with the grim satisfaction of a teacher observing a student master a difficult lesson. But underneath that satisfaction was something else, something that felt like shame. He doubted her, not just her capability, her right to be here. He'd come to Afghanistan believing that women in combat was a political experiment that would get people killed. He'd been prepared to write a report recommending the program be shut down. And Sarah Mackenzie had spent the last 24 hours dismantling assumptions Morrison had built a career on. Sir, Matthews was at his shoulder again, always there. The young lieutenant had become Morrison's shadow over the past day. Taliban radio traffic is increasing. They're arguing with each other. About what? The translator listened. His eyes widened. Sir, they're arguing about whether to continue the operation. Some of them want to withdraw. They're saying they're fighting a demon, a spirit that can't be killed. How many have deserted so far? Matthews checked his notes. We've tracked 6 fighters leaving the operational area, just walking away, no contact, no pursuit. They're abandoning their posts and heading south. Morrison did the math. 35 fighters at the start, 6 deserted, 5 confirmed kills from Sarah's rifle. That left 24. Still dangerous, still overwhelming odds. But the force was fracturing. Fear was doing what bullets alone couldn't. It was destroying their cohesion. What's the temperature in that valley right now? 28 degrees Fahrenheit, wind chill pushing it down to about 15. And Mackenzie's been out there for how long? 31 hours, sir. Morrison thought about that. 31 hours in near-freezing temperatures. No shelter, limited food, limited water, operating on whatever she'd carried in her pack. The human body started breaking down after 48 hours of cold exposure without proper rest. After 72 hours, you were looking at serious physiological damage. Hypothermia, frostbite, the kind of injuries that cost fingers and toes and lives. Sarah Mackenzie had maybe 40 hours left before her body stopped cooperating with her will. Maybe less. Sir, we're getting something strange on the intercepts. Morrison turned. The translator was frowning at his headset. Strange how? They're talking about equipment, weapons. They're saying someone went through their supply cache and took rifles. 5 AK-47s, APKM, ammunition. Just took them while they were sleeping. They're describing how the weapons were laid out, organized. One of them is saying it's a message, that the spirit is mocking them. Morrison felt the hairs on his neck stand up. She went into their camp? That's what it sounds like, sir. Morrison stood up, walked to the large tactical display showing the valley, studied the terrain, studied the enemy positions, studied the route SEAL Team 7 would need to take to reach the extraction point, and saw it, saw what Sarah Mackenzie was doing. She's not just hunting them, she's clearing the route. Matthews looked confused. Sir? Think about it. Every position she's hit, every target she's eliminated, it's all along the path Team 7 needs to take to reach the landing zone. She's not fighting a random battle. She's systematically removing obstacles, creating a corridor. Morrison traced the line on the map with his finger. From the ravine where Rhodes and his team were pinned down, through the valley, to the primary extraction point on the northern ridge. Every enemy position along that route had either been eliminated or suppressed. And the weapons cache. She took those weapons so Team 7 could use them when they made their move. She's planning 3 steps ahead of everyone else in this valley. Matthews stared at the map, at the pattern that was suddenly obvious once you knew what you were looking for. Sir, that's brilliant. That's what professionals do, Lieutenant. They don't just react, they shape the battlefield. They turn disadvantages into opportunities. Sarah Mackenzie is outnumbered 30-1, and she's somehow managed to take control of this entire engagement. Morrison grabbed the radio, switched to Rhodes' frequency. Team 7, Overwatch. Go ahead, Overwatch. I need you to start moving toward the primary LZ. Your sniper has cleared the route. You'll find weapons cached along the way. Use them. She's creating a corridor for you. Don't waste it. Rhodes was quiet for a moment. Sir, we still have Park. He's stable, but he can't move fast. And we don't have visual confirmation that the route is clear. Trust me. Trust her. She's done the work. Now you need to do yours. Another pause. Then Rhodes's voice came back, and Morrison could hear the shift in it, the transition from doubt to determination. Copy that, Overwatch. We're moving. Morrison set down the handset. His eyes tracked the small thermal signatures that represented 7 men beginning to move through a valley that should have been their tomb, but was becoming their escape route because one woman had decided their lives were worth more than her own. He thought about the report he'd have to write, about General Hayes waiting for an assessment, about the question of whether women belonged in combat, and he realized that the question had been wrong from the start. It wasn't whether women belonged. It was whether anyone who possessed the skill, the courage, and the absolute refusal to quit belonged. And gender had nothing to do with that equation. The 48th hour came and went. Morrison hadn't moved from the TOC except to use the bathroom. He'd stopped noticing the coffee, stopped noticing Matthews bringing him food. His entire world had contracted to the screens showing a frozen valley in Afghanistan and the thermal signatures moving through it. SEAL Team 7 was making progress. Slow, agonizingly slow. Park was getting worse. Morrison could hear it in Rhodes' voice during the hourly check-ins. The corpsman was fading, losing blood despite the tourniquet, losing consciousness, losing time. They needed to move faster. But they couldn't, not with a wounded man who could barely walk. And somewhere ahead of them, Sarah Mackenzie was buying them every second she could. The sixth shot came at hour 50, a Taliban commander. Not the leader, the deputy, the man standing next to the leader. The drone feed showed the two men talking. One of them dropped. The other's heat signature exploded with frantic movement, running, screaming, covered in his deputy's blood. Jesus, Matthews whispered. She could have killed the leader. Why take the second? Morrison understood immediately. Because dead leaders become martyrs. Broken leaders become cautionary tales. She just destroyed that man's authority without firing a second shot. Look at the radio traffic. The translator was already nodding. Sir, they're in chaos. The leader is screaming contradictory orders. Half his men aren't responding. They're saying he's cursed, that the spirit marked him. Morrison felt a fierce pride that surprised him with its intensity. This wasn't just good tactics. This was psychological warfare at its finest. The kind of thing they'd taught in special forces courses and CIA training programs. The kind of thing you couldn't learn from books. You had to live it, feel it, understand it at a level that went beyond doctrine. Sarah Mackenzie understood it, and she was using that understanding to dismantle an enemy force that should have overwhelmed her. Sir, Matthews pointed at the screen, Taliban elements are consolidating. They're pulling back to their main compound, defensive posture. Thermal signatures clustered together on Morrison's display. 35 fighters had become 24, then 18 as more deserted. They abandoned their observation posts and their ambush positions and retreated to a stone structure at the center of the valley. They're beaten. They don't know it yet, but they're beaten. She's turned them from hunters into prey. He switched to Rhodes' frequency. Team 7, enemy is consolidating at grid 4174. Your route to the LZ is clearing. How's Park? Rhodes' voice came back exhausted. Not good, sir. He needs surgery. Soon. We're moving as fast as we can. I know, keep pushing. Mackenzie's holding them off, just keep moving. Morrison sat back and closed his eyes. Not sleeping, just resting them for a moment. Behind his eyelids, he saw Sarah Mackenzie. Not the photograph from her file, the real woman, moving through snow and darkness, rifle in hand, cold eating through her gear, body breaking down, but still fighting. Still buying time for men who doubted her. He opened his eyes and looked at Matthews. Lieutenant, get me Mackenzie's biometric data. Sir, she's not wearing a tracker. Yes, she is. Every ground branch operator has one sewn into their gear. It's passive, doesn't transmit unless we ping it. Ping it now. Matthews worked the controls. 30 seconds later, data started flooding the screen. Morrison examined the numbers and felt his chest tighten. Core temperature, 94 degrees Fahrenheit. Normal was 98.6. She was hypothermic. Not severely, not yet, but heading that direction. Heart rate, 48 beats per minute, too slow for someone engaged in combat operations. Respiration, 12 breaths per minute. Shallow, controlled. The breathing of someone trying to conserve heat. Sir, Matthew's voice was tight. These numbers, I know what they mean, Lieutenant. She's shutting down. Her body is starting to fail. How long does she have? Morrison did the math. The cruel, unforgiving math of cold weather injuries and human physiology. 12 hours, maybe less. After that, her fine motor control goes. Can't shoot straight. Can't think clearly. Hypothermia starts making decisions for her. We need to extract her, now. With what? We don't have QRF standing by. We don't have clearance to send a bird into hostile territory. And even if we did, she'd refuse. You know she would. Matthews looked like he wanted to argue, couldn't find the words. Morrison stood up, made a decision that would probably end his career. Get me a helicopter. Sir? You heard me. I want a bird spun up and ready to go. Medical team, combat rescue crew, everything. Sir, we don't have authorization for... I'm authorizing it. Bill me the court-martial. Bill me the congressional hearing. I don't care. That soldier out there has been fighting alone for 50 hours to save 7 men. I'm not leaving her in the cold because some officer behind a desk says we need permission. Matthews stared at him, then nodded and grabbed a phone. Morrison turned back to the screen, studied the thermal feed. Sarah Mackenzie's biometric data scrolled past. Her body temperature dropped another 1/10 of a degree. Hold on, kid, he whispered to a screen that couldn't hear him. Just hold on a little longer. The 54th hour brought the crisis. SEAL Team 7 found the weapons cache. The drone feed showed them discovering 5 AK-47s laid out on a flat rock like an offering from the gods. Torres grabbed the PKM. The team's firepower tripled in an instant. But more importantly, Morrison saw what it did to their morale. Rhodes' next radio transmission had something in it Morrison hadn't heard before. Hope. Overwatch, we found the cache, just like you said. Mackenzie left us everything we need. Copy that, Team 7. What's your ETA to the LZ? 4 hours, maybe 5 with Park, but we can make it now. Roger, keep moving. Morrison checked the time. 4 hours would put them at the landing zone at approximately 1400 hours. 58 hours after the initial ambush. 58 hours that Sarah Mackenzie had been alone in the cold. He pulled up her biometric data again. Core temperature 92.8, heart rate 45. The numbers were screaming at him. She was dying. Not quickly, not dramatically, but dying nonetheless. The cold was winning. The exhaustion was winning. The simple mathematics of human endurance against an environment that didn't care about courage or skill or determination. Sir, Matthews again, I've got confirmation on the helicopter. Charlie 6-4 is spinning up. Medical crew aboard. They can be airborne in 20 minutes. Tell them to stand by. I want them ready to go the moment Team 7 reaches the LZ. Understood, sir. Morrison studied the tactical display. At the corridor Sarah had created. At the enemy positions she'd neutralized. At the route she'd cleared with bullets and blood. And a kind of determination that Morrison had seen maybe twice in his entire career. Lieutenant, pull up the Taliban radio intercepts from the last hour. Matthews brought them up. The translator listened and started speaking. Sir, they're still talking about the spirit, but now they're talking about withdrawal. The commander is trying to hold them together, but he's losing control. 3 more fighters just left. Walked away, refused orders. What's the current count? 15 fighters remaining, down from 35 at the start. Morrison felt something settle in his chest. Sarah Mackenzie had cut the enemy force in half through a combination of precision shooting and psychological warfare. She'd turned their fear against them, made them prisoners of their own imagination. And she did it alone, Morrison said quietly. One woman, no support, no backup, no extraction plan. She just decided 7 lives were worth whatever it cost her. Matthews looked at him with an expression Morrison couldn't quite read. "Sir, can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "When you came here, you thought women couldn't do this, didn't belong in combat. Do you still think that?" Morrison was quiet for a long moment. "No," he said finally. "I don't. I was wrong. Not about biology, not about differences. I was wrong about what those differences meant. I thought they made women weaker. Turns out they just made them different. And different isn't the same as less." He turned to look at Matthews fully. "Sarah Mackenzie has shown me something I should have learned in Vietnam. The warrior spirit doesn't care about your gender. It doesn't care about your size or your strength or whether you can do 40 pull-ups. It cares about whether you have the courage to stand when everyone else runs, whether you'll sacrifice yourself for people who doubt you, whether you can stare into the abyss and decide that today isn't the day you quit." Morrison looked back at the screen. "That woman out there is one of the finest soldiers I've ever seen. And I've seen a lot. The fact that I almost missed it because I was too busy looking at what she was instead of what she could do. That's on me. That's my failure, not hers." The radio crackled. Rhodes's voice, urgent. "Overwatch, we're 3 clicks from the LZ, but we've got a problem. There's open ground, 200 meters, no cover. If there's anyone watching, we're exposed." Morrison checked the tactical display, saw the killing ground, saw the perfect ambush opportunity, felt his stomach drop. "Team 7, hold position. Let me check the route." He scanned the thermal feed, looked for heat signatures, found none. The observation posts that should have covered that approach were empty, abandoned. Sarah had cleared them. But Morrison needed to be sure. "Lieutenant, give me maximum resolution on grid 4376. I want to see every rock in that valley." The screen zoomed, enhanced, showed 200 meters of open snow with perfect sightlines from 3 different ridges. Any competent force would have observation posts covering this ground. Any competent commander would have set an ambush here. The ridges were empty. Morrison switched back to Rhodes. "Team 7, route is clear. I say again, route is clear. Your sniper has eliminated all observation posts covering the approach. Move now while you have the window." "Copy, Overwatch. We're moving." 7 thermal signatures emerged from cover and started across that open ground on Morrison's display. They moved with the agonizing slowness of men carrying a wounded brother through knee-deep snow. Every second felt like an hour. Every meter felt like a kilometer. And somewhere in the mountains, Sarah Mackenzie had to be observing too. Rifle up, scope trained on those ridges, ready to kill anyone who threatened her team, even though her hands were probably shaking too hard to guarantee the shot, even though her body was shutting down, even though she'd already done more than anyone had a right to ask. The thermal signatures reached the far side. Safe. Morrison exhaled, realized he'd been holding his breath for 6 minutes straight. "Team 7 is across, sir," Matthews said unnecessarily. Morrison nodded, couldn't speak, couldn't trust his voice. He'd spent 54 hours monitoring Sarah Mackenzie do the impossible, tracking her fight an entire enemy force alone, observing her clear a route for men who doubted her, seeing her choose their lives over her own survival again and again and again. And he realized something that hit him like a physical blow. He hadn't just been wrong about women in combat. He'd been wrong about what combat meant. He thought it was about strength and aggression and the ability to inflict violence. And those things mattered, but they weren't the whole story. Combat was about sacrifice, about deciding that someone else's life was worth more than your own, about doing your job when doing your job meant dying alone in the snow so your brothers could live. Sarah Mackenzie understood that in a way Morrison had somehow forgotten over 40 years of service. She'd reminded him what it meant to be a soldier. Not the rank, not the medals, not the glory, the willingness to stand in the gap, alone if necessary, until the job was done or you couldn't stand anymore. "Sir," Matthews was pointing at the screen. Mackenzie's biometric data, her core temperature just dropped to 92.3. Sir, that's dangerous. That's approaching severe hypothermia. Morrison examined the numbers. The thermal feed showing empty mountains, the clock showing 54 hours and counting. How long until Team 7 reaches the LZ? 90 minutes, maybe less. And how long until Mackenzie's body shuts down completely? Matthews consulted his medical reference. At this rate of temperature decline, 6 hours, maybe 8. But her fine motor control is probably already compromised. She might not be able to shoot accurately anymore. Morrison thought about that. About a woman who'd spent 54 hours proving she belonged in a fight she'd never asked to join. About whether she had 6 more hours in her. About whether it mattered. She'd already done the impossible. She'd cleared the route. She'd bought the time. She'd proven everything that needed proving. Now the question was whether Morrison could get to her before the cold did what 35 Taliban fighters couldn't. He grabbed the radio handset, made the call that would define the last act of his career. Charlie 6-4, this is Overwatch. You are cleared for immediate takeoff. Proceed to grid 4278. Be advised you are entering hostile territory. Medical emergency, 1 soldier in extremis. Cold weather injury, possible hypothermia. Confirm ready. The pilot's voice came back steady. Overwatch, Charlie 6-4 copies all. We're spinning up now. ETA to grid 42 minutes. Sir, is this authorized? Morrison smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. Charlie 6-4, I'm a 58-year-old colonel 3 weeks from retirement. This is either the best decision of my career or the one that ends it. Either way, that soldier out there has earned a ride home. So yes, it's authorized by me. And if anyone has a problem with that, they can take it up with me after we bring her back alive. Roger that, sir. Charlie 6-4 is airborne. Morrison set down the handset, looked at Matthews. The young lieutenant was staring at him with something that might have been admiration or might have been fear. Sir, you just violated about 6 different regulations. 7, actually, I counted. But that woman out there has been violating the laws of human endurance for 54 hours. I figure I owe her at least 1 court-martial's worth of support. Matthews smiled, actually smiled. For what it's worth, sir, I think you made the right call. We'll find out, Lieutenant, we'll find out. Morrison turned back to the screen. The helicopter's icon moved toward the mountains. SEAL Team 7 closed on the landing zone. Sarah Mackenzie's biometric data continued its slow, inexorable decline. And he made a promise to a woman he'd never met. A woman he'd doubted. A woman who'd spent the last 54 hours teaching him that courage had no gender and skill had no limit, and that the only thing that mattered in war was whether you had the strength to keep fighting when fighting was the only thing standing between your brothers and death. Hold on, Sarah, he whispered. Just a little longer. I'm coming for you. And when I find you, I'm going to do something I should have done from the start. I'm going to thank you. And I'm going to make sure everyone knows what you did out here. The screen showed empty mountains, empty sky, numbers declining on a medical readout. But Morrison knew she was out there, still fighting, still observing, still refusing to quit, even though her body was begging her to. Because that's what soldiers did. The real ones. The ones who understood that the uniform was a promise, and the mission was sacred, and that coming home mattered less than making sure your brothers came home. Sarah Mackenzie was that kind of soldier. And Morrison was going to make damn sure she got the recognition she'd earned, even if it cost him everything. The silence was what broke Morrison first. For 56 hours there had been sound, radio chatter, gunfire picked up by distant microphones. The translator's voice converting Pashto panic into English updates. The steady rhythm of combat happening somewhere beyond the cameras, beyond the satellites, beyond everything except Sarah Mackenzie's willingness to keep fighting. Then nothing. 14 minutes of absolute silence while Morrison stared at screens that showed empty mountains and a biometric readout that was starting to look like a medical textbook's definition of dying. Core temperature, 92.1 degrees Fahrenheit. Heart rate, 43 beats per minute. Respiration, 10 breaths per minute. Lieutenant Matthews stood beside him, young face tight with fear. "Sir, we need to—" "I know what we need to do, Lieutenant. I'm doing it." Morrison's hand was already on the radio, switching frequencies, reaching out to the helicopter that was 40 minutes away from a woman who might not have 40 minutes left. Charlie 6-4, Overwatch. Increase speed. Medical situation is deteriorating. How fast can you get there? The pilot's voice came back with a kind of calm that came from flying through worse situations and living to tell about it. Overwatch, we're pushing it now. But sir, we're flying into hostile territory with zero ground support. If we take fire, we're going to have a bad day. Morrison closed his eyes, opened them, made another decision that would look great in a court-martial transcript. Charlie 6-4, you have authorization to return fire with all available weapons. Anything that shoots at you, you put it down. I'll handle the paperwork. A pause. Then the pilot's voice came back with something that might have been a smile in it. Copy that, Overwatch. Any other impossible things you want us to do while we're breaking regulations? Yeah, bring her home alive. Roger that, sir. Charlie 6-4 is inbound hot. ETA 32 minutes. Morrison set down the handset. The tactical display showed SEAL Team 7, 300 meters from the landing zone. Moving slow. Park was barely conscious. They were carrying him now, 2 men under each arm, dragging more than walking. But they were moving. And somewhere in the mountains ahead of them, Sarah Mackenzie was waiting. Had to be. Because in 14 minutes of silence, the only thing Morrison knew for certain was that she hadn't stopped, hadn't quit, hadn't given up. She was out there, and she was watching. The question was, what condition she'd be in when they found her. Movement. Morrison saw it on the thermal feed before Matthews did, a heat signature appearing where there hadn't been one before. Faint, barely registering, the thermal equivalent of a whisper. There, grid 42 to 79, single signature, low heat output. Matthews zoomed the camera, enhanced the image. The signature resolved into a human shape. Prone, rifle extended, facing north toward where the Taliban compound sat in defensive lockdown. Sir, that's her. That has to be her. Morrison stared at the screen, at the faint thermal glow of a human body that was losing heat faster than it could generate it. At a woman who should have been running for the extraction point, but was instead still holding security, still observing, still ready to kill anyone who threatened her team, even though the team was 300 meters away and moving towards safety. What's she doing? Matthews whispered. Morrison understood immediately, understood with the clarity of 40 years' experience and the recognition of seeing himself in someone else's choices. She's holding the line. She won't leave her position until everyone is on that helicopter. That's the job. That's what professionals do. He grabbed the radio, switched to the SEAL team's frequency. Team 7, Overwatch. I have visual on Mackenzie. She's at grid 4279, approximately 100 meters north of your position. She's in Overwatch position, still maintaining security. Rhodes's voice came back exhausted in something else, something that might have been awe. Overwatch, confirm. Mackenzie is still out there? Still covering us? Affirmative. And Team 7, you need to know, she's hypothermic, severe. When you see her, she's going to need immediate medical attention, but she's not going to ask for it. She's going to try to walk to that bird on her own. Don't let her. Understood, sir. We see the LZ. We're almost there. 7 thermal signatures emerged from the tree line onto open ground where a helicopter would land in 28 minutes. They stopped, set Park down gently, formed a perimeter, and 1 thermal signature that should have joined them didn't. Sarah Mackenzie stayed in her position, rifle up, still scanning, still prepared for threats that weren't coming because she'd spent 56 hours making sure they couldn't. Sir, Matthew's voice was tight. Her core temperature just dropped to 91.8. Sir, that's critical. I know what it is, Lieutenant. Morrison switched frequencies again, this time to a channel he knew Sarah would be monitoring if she was still conscious enough to monitor anything. Ghost, this is Overwatch. If you can hear me, your team is secure. They're at the LZ. The corridor is clear. You did it. Now get to that landing zone and let someone else take over. Silence. Morrison waited, counted to 10, tried again. Ghost, acknowledge. This is Overwatch. Acknowledge. Nothing. Matthews looked at him with eyes that were trying very hard not to show fear. Sir, maybe she can't respond. Maybe she's... The radio crackled. Sarah's voice came through, barely a whisper, words shaped with effort that shouldn't have been necessary for someone who was still breathing. Overwatch. Copy. When everyone is on that bird, then I'll come in. Not before. Something cracked in Morrison's chest. Pride and fury, and a kind of respect that went beyond anything he'd felt in 40 years of service. Ghost, you're hypothermic, critical level. You need medical attention now. After, everyone, boards first. That's protocol. Morrison looked at Matthews. The young lieutenant was shaking his head in disbelief. Sir, she's dying, and she's still arguing protocol. That's not protocol, Lieutenant. That's character. That's deciding your life matters less than doing the job right. That's what separates the warriors from everyone else. Morrison keyed the radio one more time. Copy, Ghost. But when that bird lands, you get on it. That's an order. From someone who should have been giving you better orders from the start. Silence. Then Sarah's voice again, even fainter. Copy. Overwatch. And sir, thank you. Morrison set down the handset. Couldn't speak. Couldn't trust his voice. He turned to the screen. A thermal signature that was barely visible anymore. A woman who'd fought alone for 56 hours, refusing medical help until her team was safe. Courage that transcended training and doctrine, and every assumption he'd ever made about who belonged in war. Charlie 6-4 is 5 minutes out, sir. Morrison nodded. The helicopter icon closed on the landing zone. SEAL Team 7 held their perimeter. Sarah Mackenzie stayed in position, rifle up, scanning for threats that existed only in her determination to do the job completely. The helicopter appeared on the horizon. Morrison could see it through the drone feed, black against gray sky, rotors beating the air into submission, coming in fast and low because the pilot understood what Morrison understood. This wasn't a routine extraction. This was a race against hypothermia and exhaustion and the simple mathematics of how long a human body could function in conditions designed to kill it. The Black Hawk flared, touched down, snow exploded outward in a white storm that temporarily blinded the thermal cameras. Morrison switched to optical feed. The crew chief jumped out, waving the team aboard. Park loaded first, medics already working on him before the skids left the ground. The SEAL team piled in. Rhodes, Torres, Sullivan, Brooks, Rivera, Santiago, 7 men. Safe. Morrison switched back to thermal, found Sarah's signature. She lowered the rifle, started to stand, and it took 8 seconds. 8 seconds to go from prone to standing. 8 seconds of a body that didn't want to obey anymore. 8 seconds of muscles that had been pushed past every reasonable limit and were now operating on nothing except will. Matthews counted out loud. 1, 2, 3. Jesus, sir, she can barely move. 4, 5, 6. Sarah Mackenzie forced herself upright through sheer determination. Took a step, then another. Used the rifle as a crutch because her legs weren't reliable anymore. 7, 8. Sir, she's up. She's moving. Morrison grabbed the radio. Team 7, Mackenzie is inbound. She's mobile, but barely. Someone get out there and help her. Torres's voice came back. Already on it, sir. I'm moving. The drone feed showed Torres jump from the helicopter and run towards Sarah. He reached her, reached out to help. Sarah waved him off. Morrison felt his throat tighten. She's refusing help. Even now. Torres was talking to her. Morrison couldn't hear the conversation, but he could imagine it, could see it in their body language. Torres offering assistance. Sarah declining. Torres insisting. Sarah walking past him toward the helicopter under her own power because that's what the mission required. She made it 20 meters. Then her left knee buckled. Morrison was on his feet before he realized he'd moved. As if standing in the TOC 3,000 miles away could somehow help her stay upright in the mountains of Afghanistan. Torres caught her. The drone camera showed the big SEAL wrap an arm around Sarah's waist and half carry, half drag her the last 30 meters to the helicopter. "Get her aboard," Morrison whispered to a screen that couldn't hear him. "Get her aboard and get her warm." Torres lifted Sarah into the Black Hawk. She disappeared into the cargo bay. The crew chief gave a thumbs up. The helicopter lifted off in another storm of snow and noise, and the particular violence of machinery imposing human will on an indifferent universe. Morrison sat down hard. His legs had been holding him up through something other than muscle for the past hour. Now that Sarah was safe, now that the immediate crisis had passed, his body reminded him that he was 58 years old and hadn't slept in 60 hours. Matthews was beside him immediately. "Sir, you should rest. We can monitor the flight from here." "I'll rest when I know she's stable." Morrison switched to the helicopter's internal camera. The image was grainy, shot from a fixed position in the cargo bay, but it showed him what he needed to see. Sarah Mackenzie sat on the floor, back against the bulkhead, rifle across her lap. A medic was trying to examine her. She was waving him off, pointing to Park, making the medic check the wounded corpsman first, even though Sarah was the one who'd been in the cold for 56 hours. Something that might have been a laugh or might have been a sob caught in Morrison's throat. She's still putting everyone else first, even now, even barely conscious. He observed the medic give up trying to examine Sarah and turned to Park. Sarah's head dropped forward, her eyes closed. "Sir, her biometric data. Temperature is holding at 91.6, not dropping anymore. Heart rate is up to 52. She's stabilizing." Morrison nodded. Didn't trust himself to speak. He'd spent 56 hours tracking Sarah Mackenzie do the impossible. Observing her proved that everything he'd believed about women in combat was wrong. Seeing her demonstrate courage and skill and determination that transcended gender and training and every assumption Morrison had built a career on. And now, seeing her sit in that helicopter with her eyes closed and her rifle across her lap, refusing medical attention until her team was cared for, Morrison understood something that changed the shape of everything he thought he knew about war. The greatest warriors weren't the ones who killed the most enemies, or won the most battles, or came home with the most medals. The greatest warriors were the ones who'd sacrifice everything to make sure their brothers and sisters came home, who'd fight impossible odds alone because that's what the mission required, who'd push their bodies past the breaking point and still refuse help because someone else needed it more. Sarah Mackenzie was that kind of warrior, and Morrison was going to make damn sure the world knew it. The Black Hawk touched down at FOB Chapman 63 minutes later. Morrison had left the TOC for the first time in 60 hours. His joints protested. His back screamed. His knees reminded him that he was too old for this kind of stress. He didn't care. He stood on the landing pad as the helicopter settled onto the tarmac in a storm of dust and noise. Stood at attention. A 58-year-old colonel with 40 years of service and 3 weeks until retirement, waiting to meet the soldier who just taught him what service really meant. The crew chief opened the door. Park came out first on a stretcher, medics rushing him toward the field hospital. The SEAL team followed. Rhodes, Torres, Sullivan, Brooks, Rivera, Santiago. 7 men, alive, exhausted, carrying weapons they'd found cached along a route cleared by a woman they doubted. Torres stopped when he saw Morrison, came to attention despite the exhaustion written in every line of his body. "Sir," Morrison returned the salute. "Captain, status?" "Park is stable, sir. Medics say he'll keep the arm. He'll see his wife. He'll meet his daughter." Morrison nodded, felt something ease in his chest. "And Mackenzie?" Torres's expression changed, became something Morrison couldn't quite read. "Sir, she's walking off that bird on her own. We tried to help. She refused. Said she'd started this mission on her feet and she'd finish it on her feet." Morrison looked past Torres to the helicopter, saw Sarah Mackenzie appear in the doorway. She looked like winter itself had taken human form. Pale, hollow-eyed, moving with the careful deliberation of someone whose body was barely obeying anymore. But she stepped down from that helicopter, put both feet on the tarmac, stood. Morrison walked toward her. Sarah saw him coming, tried to come to attention, couldn't quite manage it. Morrison stopped 3 feet away. They stood looking at each other across a gap that was only 3 feet in distance, but represented assumptions being dismantled by proof. Then Morrison did something he'd done maybe twice in his entire career. He saluted her. Not the casual salute of routine military courtesy, the full, formal salute, hand crisp, eyes locked, reserved for warriors, not ranks. Sarah's eyes widened. She tried to return the salute. Her hand shook so badly she couldn't hold it steady. Morrison lowered his hand. "At ease, Staff Sergeant. That wasn't for your rank. That was for what you did out there." Sarah swayed, caught herself. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "Just doing my job, sir." "No, your job was reconnaissance. What you did out there was save 7 lives at the cost of your own. That's not a job. That's a choice. And it's the kind of choice that defines what it means to be a soldier." Morrison took a step closer. "I came here to evaluate you, to decide if women belonged in combat, to write a report that would determine the future of your program." He paused, let the words settle. "I'm writing that report tonight, and it's going to say that you're one of the finest combat operators I've seen in 40 years. That gender has nothing to do with capability. That courage isn't masculine or feminine, it's just courage, and you have more of it than most men I've commanded." Sarah's eyes were starting to lose focus. Morrison could see hypothermia pulling her toward unconsciousness. Did Park? He's going to be fine. He's going to see his baby. Because of you." Sarah nodded, smiled slightly, started to fall. Morrison caught her, felt how depleted she was, felt the cold radiating off her body, felt bones that shouldn't be that close to the surface. "Medic! I need a medic, now!" Torres was there in an instant, helping Morrison lower Sarah to the ground. The medics arrived with a stretcher, started working. 4. Warm fluids, thermal blankets. Sarah's hand found Morrison's arm, gripped with surprising strength. "Sir, the team, are they?" "They're all safe. Every single one. You got them all home." Her grip relaxed, her eyes closed, and Sarah Mackenzie finally let herself stop fighting. Morrison rode with her to the field hospital, sat in the corner while doctors worked, observed them treat hypothermia and frostbite and a dozen other cold weather injuries that should have killed her, but hadn't because she'd refused to die until the job was finished. Major Chen, the head physician, came over after 30 minutes. "Colonel, she's stable. Core temperature is coming back up. We're treating the frostbite. She's going to lose some tissue, toes probably, maybe fingers, but she'll live." Morrison nodded, couldn't speak. Chen sat down beside him. "Sir, I've treated cold weather injuries for 8 years. I've seen what happens when people push too far. Staff Sergeant Mackenzie pushed farther than anyone I've ever treated. Another 6 hours and we'd be having a very different conversation. But she didn't have another 6 hours, Major. She had exactly the amount of time she needed. No more, no less." Chen looked at him for a long moment. "Sir, she's family to you?" Morrison thought about that. Thought about a career spent commanding young men. Thought about a daughter he barely knew because he'd been gone her entire childhood. Thought about grandchildren who called him sir instead of grandpa, because that's what you became when you gave everything to the uniform. No, Major, she's not family. She's what I wish my generation had been. We fought hard, but we fought with hate. She fought with love. Every bullet was to protect her team. That's the difference. Morrison stood, his knees cracked, his back complained. When she wakes up, tell her I'll be back. I have a report to write, and phone calls to make, and probably a career to end, but it'll be worth it. Chen nodded. Morrison walked out of the field hospital into cold Afghan air that felt warm compared to the mountains where Sarah Mackenzie had spent 56 hours refusing to quit. He had work to do. The report took Morrison 6 hours to write. He sat in his quarters with a laptop and 40 years of experience and tried to find words that could capture what Sarah Mackenzie had done. In the end, he kept it simple. Subject: Operational Assessment, Sarah Mackenzie, Ground Branch Field Operator. General Hayes, you sent me to Afghanistan to evaluate whether women can perform in direct combat roles. You asked for honesty. Here it is. Staff Sergeant Sarah Mackenzie is one of the finest combat operators I have observed in 40 years of military service. Gender is irrelevant. Her performance over a 56-hour period, operating alone against a numerically superior enemy force in extreme environmental conditions, demonstrated skills that would be exceptional regardless of gender. Key observations: marksmanship, 11 confirmed enemy casualties, 0 wasted ammunition. Engagements range from 200 to 520 meters in sub-zero conditions. Tactical acumen, single-handedly disrupted a 35-person enemy force through combination of precision targeting and psychological operations. Created a corridor allowing 7 friendly personnel to reach extraction. Physical endurance, operated for 56 hours with minimal food, water, or rest. Sustained severe hypothermia and frostbite, but continued mission until all friendly personnel were secure. Leadership, maintained mission focus despite being separated from her team, made decisions that prioritized team survival over personal safety. Recommendation: expand the Ground Branch Female Operator Program immediately. Staff Sergeant Mackenzie has proven the concept beyond any doubt. Any continued resistance to women in combat roles is based on prejudice rather than evidence. Additional note: I came to Afghanistan believing women did not belong in direct combat. I was wrong. My 40 years of certainty were 40 years of being wrong about what made an effective warrior. Staff Sergeant Mackenzie taught me that lesson. The military would benefit from listening to what she has to teach. Respectfully, Colonel James Morrison, U.S. Army. Morrison read it 3 times. Then he hit send and sat back. His phone rang 90 seconds later. Jim, what the hell did you just send me? General Hayes. Morrison could hear the confusion in his voice. The truth, sir, like you asked. You're recommending we expand a program you were supposed to evaluate critically? You're saying a female operator is one of the finest you've seen in 40 years? Yes, sir, because it's true. I observed her for 56 hours, saw her do things I've witnessed maybe twice in my career, tracked her save 7 lives while her own body was shutting down from cold. Gender didn't factor into any of it. Skill did. Courage did. Determination did. Hayes was quiet for a long moment. Jim, do you understand what this means? For the program? For women in combat? For everything we've been debating for decades? Yes, sir. It means we stop debating and start accepting reality. Warriors come in all shapes and sizes. What matters is what they do, not what they look like. Another pause. Okay, I'll take this to the Joint Chiefs. This is going to cause waves, Jim, big ones. I know, sir, but it's the right thing, and I didn't spend 40 years in uniform to start lying now. Fair enough. How's Mackenzie doing? She'll live. Lost some toes, maybe a finger, but she'll recover. And sir, when she does, I want to be the one to pin her silver star. Because that's the minimum she deserves for what she did out there. Hayes laughed, actually laughed. Silver star? Jim, you're talking about someone who held off an entire enemy force alone for 56 hours. That's Medal of Honor territory. Morrison felt something warm spread through his chest. Then let's give her what she earned, sir. And let's make sure every person who doubted that women could do this job sees exactly what she accomplished. Consider it done. Anything else? Morrison thought about Sarah Mackenzie lying in a hospital bed, thought about the team she'd saved, thought about the future she'd just secured for every woman who wanted to serve. Yes, sir. One more thing. I'm putting in my retirement paperwork today, 3 weeks early. I want my last official act to be witnessing what happens when we stop underestimating people based on assumptions instead of evidence. You've earned it, Jim. And for what it's worth, thank you for being willing to change your mind. Not many men with 40 years of certainty can do that. Morrison hung up and sat in the quiet of his quarters. Outside, the Afghan sun was setting. Inside, Morrison felt something settle that had been unsettled for longer than he could remember. He'd come here believing one thing. He'd leave believing another. That was growth. That was wisdom. That was what happened when you stopped protecting your pride and started paying attention to truth. Sarah Mackenzie had given him that gift, and Morrison was going to spend whatever time he had left making sure she got the recognition she deserved. 6 months later, Morrison stood at Fort Bragg in dress uniform that felt tight after 40 years of wearing it. The ceremony was smaller than it should have been. Sarah had requested that. No media, no fanfare, just the team she'd saved and the officers who needed to witness what happened when courage met opportunity. Park was there with his wife Emily and their daughter. 7 pounds, 4 ounces, born healthy, named Sarah. The SEAL team stood in formation. Rhodes, Torres, Sullivan, Brooks, Rivera, Santiago. Men who'd learned that respect had nothing to do with gender and everything to do with what you did when everything went wrong. And Sarah Mackenzie stood at attention in the center of it all, walking with a slight limp that would never fully heal, missing 2 toes and the tip of her left ring finger, but alive, present, ready. The general who'd sent Morrison to Afghanistan stood at the podium. The Silver Star is awarded for gallantry in action against an enemy of the United States. Staff Sergeant Sarah Mackenzie demonstrated extraordinary heroism while deployed in support of Operation Enduring Freedom. Morrison listened to the citation, listened to a dry recitation of facts that couldn't capture the truth. 11 enemy casualties, 56 hours of sustained operations, 7 friendly personnel extracted safely. But numbers never told the whole story. When the general finished reading, Morrison stepped forward. They'd given him the honor of pinning the medal, one last official act before retirement. He stood in front of Sarah Mackenzie, looked at her eyes, saw the mountains there, saw the cold, saw the determination that had carried her through hell and brought 7 men home alive. Morrison pinned the Silver Star to her uniform. Then he did something that wasn't in the ceremony script. He removed his own combat infantryman badge, the one he'd worn since Vietnam, the one that represented 40 years of service in sacrifice and everything he'd believed about what made a soldier. This belonged to my best friend, Jimmy Reeves, killed in Vietnam in 1969. I've carried it for 42 years, waiting for someone worthy. Morrison pinned it below the Silver Star. You're the daughter I never had and the son I always wanted. You taught an old soldier that courage has no gender, that skill has no limits, that the only thing that matters in war is whether you'll stand when everyone else runs. Sarah's eyes were wet. Morrison's might have been too. Carry on, Ghost. And when I'm gone, I want someone to remember what we fought for. Not territory, not politics, each other. Sarah saluted. Morrison returned it. And in that moment, assumptions met proof, and assumptions lost. The ceremony ended. The crowd dispersed. Morrison found himself alone with Torres. The Big Seal looked uncomfortable. "Sir, I owe you an apology." "You don't owe me anything, Captain." "Yes, sir, I do. I doubted her. Made jokes. Bet she'd quit. I was wrong about everything." Morrison put a hand on Torres's shoulder. "You learned. You changed. That's what matters." Torres looked at Sarah across the room, talking to Park and his family. "She saved our lives, sir, and never asked for anything. That's what makes her dangerous, son. She fights because it's right, not because it's rewarded." Morrison left Fort Bragg that evening. Retirement papers signed. Career over. But he didn't feel finished. He felt like he'd finally learned something worth knowing. 14 years later, Morrison sat in a VA hospital visiting wounded veterans. 72 years old now, gray hair gone white, hands that shook from more than just age. A young female Marine sat in a wheelchair beside him, double amputee, Afghanistan. He showed her a photograph on his phone. Sarah Mackenzie, 42, standing beside the CIA director. First female ground branch commander takes office. The Marine's eyes widened. "She's real?" "Real as they come," Morrison said. "And so are you." Morrison died 3 months later. Heart attack, quick, the way old soldiers preferred. His funeral was at Arlington. Full military honors. Sarah Mackenzie gave the eulogy. She stood at the podium in dress uniform, walked with the limp that would never heal, looked out at a crowd of officers and enlisted, young and old, men and women who'd come to honor a man who'd served for 40 years. "Colonel Morrison taught me something important. He taught me that being wrong isn't weakness. Changing your mind isn't failure. The real failure is refusing to see truth when it's staring you in the face." She looked at the flag-draped coffin. "He came to Afghanistan to evaluate me. He left as my champion. That's courage. The courage to choose truth over pride." She placed her hand on the coffin. "Thank you, sir, for watching, for believing." The ceremony ended. They folded the flag, fired the salute, played taps, and Sarah Mackenzie stood at attention beside a grave that held a man who'd learned that warriors recognize warriors, and everything else was just noise. The mountains of Afghanistan were far away now. The 56 hours had faded into memory, but what remained was this: a woman who'd refused to quit when quitting would be easier. A man who'd been brave enough to change his mind. In proof that legacy isn't what you believe, it's what you do when those beliefs are challenged. Sarah Mackenzie was still out there, still serving, still leading. And the warrior spirit she'd proven had no gender, no age, no limit. It only required one thing: the refusal to stop when stopping would be easier.